Record Show.
And co-host Marine Corps Map, coming to you on Monday and Tuesdays in Studio A, noon to 2 Eastern.
And Studio B on Wednesday nights, 10 p.m. to 12 a.m. Eastern, with educational, instructional, information, and situational updates, often with wonderful guests on the current landscape in the U.S. and overseas.
This is a go.
We are with you, side to side, and back to back.
Please join us on Monday through Wednesdays,
as well as other hosts and guests here on Revolution Radio.
We're not gonna take it anymore. That's right, we're not gonna take it anymore. We said we're not gonna take it anymore. That's right, we're not gonna take it anymore.
I'm Reverend Medium Tracy Lockwood, and I'd like to invite you to join me as I discuss life from a medium's perspective. I'll be talking about insights that I've gained through readings, with topics like your guides, angels, animal communication, past lives, our transition, and the afterlife. We'll take a deeper look at the metaphysical meanings of symbols and totems, and I'll give you some practical exercises to help you develop your own natural psychic ability. Join me on From a Medium's Perspective.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Well, it's time to stumble down the road with host Bridgette Lyn Dolgoff and co-host Jenny Barr as they carry stones, dig holes, and wield their shovels along the way. On Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. This is not a seated event. As they talk, run, stumble, carry, dig, drag, laugh, fight, sing and pray, dance and kick and scream, and oftentimes fall. Hey, is that a stone or a buffalo check? Now, here are your hosts for the next 2 hours on carrying stones and digging holes. But I won't be there.
The hell I won't.
Hey everybody, this is Bridgette Lyn Dolgoff, carrying stones and digging holes, and I am your host for the next 2 hours. Today the format is going to be a little bit different because I'm in proximity with my guest, and so you may need to turn the volume up. We're using my tablet, and we're both going to have a conversation that way, and that's just kind of how things are going to fly today. And so my guest is a good friend of mine, and we do a lot of, we'll just call it a lot of dreaming work, and we communicate with each other on kind of a really deep level about, ideas of consciousness that could be related to people like Lujan Matus or Carlo Castaneda or Don Juan Matus, and other people who have written about or journeyed through the dreaming worlds. So we were just going to have a conversation today about some of the topics that we normally discuss on a daily basis. And so my guest is Ryan Hunter. He is, practicing jujitsu. What form of jujitsu?
So our system is mixed together. It's Danzanru Zenyo Bujutsu, which is takes some of the traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu, the martial art of the samurai, but combines it with the Tibetan martial art of Lama Pai, which is, among other things, but which is was a secret guarded by the lamas. Actually, my sensei got specific permission from the Dalai Lama to even show and teach this art, which the Dalai Lama gave because after the Chinese came in and dispersed the lamas, tried to kill them off, a lot of them, the art was dying, the knowledge was dying, and so when he found out that Herb knew this martial art, he sent a message immediately to give him permission to carry on the art and teach it, because up to that point it was considered a secret, and he was only allowed to pass it on to his firstborn son. So that was kind of nice.
So, and also Ryan is also, sorry, I have to kind of go back and forth here. So maybe anybody out there who's listening might be able to let me know how the sound sounds. I mean, we're doing the best we can with the technology, with what we're working with today. So that's it. So also Ryan is also back in school, and he teaches, and he's also working on his PhD in mathematics. So very interesting soul, and I've known him for, I don't know, about 6 years now. And we connected basically on specific kind of work dealing with, crossing over into other worlds and having, beings being piggybacked back, and how to, basically learn practices to be able to deal with that. Because some beings can't be exorcised off or out. Some beings are kind of permanent, and we have to learn how to deal with them in a position of power in order to, be able to continue to live our lives. So anyway, I was just going to put out there that this morning I got an email from a friend of mine from Australia that was listening to a Cliff High video. He sent the video, I haven't had time, and he was kind of asking me some questions. But apparently the infrared night vision goggles are, let's just say, with some of the military activity and military personnel are starting to talk about how they can see beings that are in with us that we can't see physically, and that it's starting to terrify and horrify people, and they're trying to figure out some other mechanism in order to see at night, but maybe using a different visual frequency, because there's so many beings that are trafficking Earth right now. And so just going to throw out there a little bit of my perspective. So all of the what do you want to call them, extraterrestrial, multidimensional, whatever kind of beings, a lot of them are not seen by our frequencies that we use to have, the kind of vision we have. I think a lot of people out there have seen the movie The Secret, and there was a story in there about the shaman, the medicine man, who noticed that there were anomalies in the ocean that shouldn't have been there. And then he spent, like several weeks praying and meditating and watching the water anomalies. And then also eventually saw the ships, which were the, colonialists, coming into the Americas. And so sometimes because of our belief systems also, it can really impair what we can see and what we can really truly see. But all these beings all have extraterrestrial, they all come from extraterrestrial areas. And when they're not in a biosuit, many of them can travel through multiple dimensional pathways. And also sometimes when we do dreaming medicines without an actual proper shaman or medicine person to protect us and bring us back clean, when we show up into these, different worlds, these multidimensional worlds, the darker beings see us and notice us, and they will traffic us and then come back with us. So it's really hard to actually send them back to once they came, because that porthole is usually closed after we come back. So a lot of the beings that are channeled, you can go to my website, Conscious of Economics and Urban Farm Project, and I have a video on there that basically says, why we shouldn't listen to, bull poop channelers is because of my experience with channelers and back 30 years ago, and the beings that people channel. So they are not, the lighter they are, the darker they really are. The information that they want to give you. Otherwise, higher evolved beings wouldn't want to try to sell you, snake oil.
Right.
So Ryan has some really good take on a lot of different stuff. And we were at breakfast and we were talking about ethics. What was it? Ethics versus morality.
Right.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I'd rather just piggyback on what you were already talking about. Let's keep the flow of the conversation going. I think I see a big increase in the some of the beings, that whatever you would like to say, non-physical or non-projecting into our 3D material world that we construct. But there are a lot of electromagnetic beings that are around us that people aren't observing. I mean, just last night I had an experience with one, but I've seen an increase in the number and just the traffic, and I think a lot of this has to do with the metals in the air and the frequencies, the electromagnetic frequencies that we were just spilling out all over the place, and it's giving them a conduit to travel and to get to this place and to move around on this earth. And really a lot of these things that people are doing with their technology open portals that they don't really know what they're screwing with. They by definition they haven't figured out where that goes before they open it up and just let something through. And exploration is great, but just allowing random interdimensional things to come into your reality is not maybe the smartest move. And there are a lot of reasons to be putting on the brakes with some of this, the 5G network, for example. But one aspect of it that doesn't get talked about too much is that it's actually pulling beings from other realities into this one, and they're having an effect on people. And it's not just, it's kind of several things are coming together. We have a culture of people who are dumbed down. They're dumbed down by the technology, by the conveniences. They're absorbed into their phone, their Facebook, their whatever is going on, and they're just satisfying themselves with this tiny little synthetic world and limiting their minds to this, which it leaves them blind, and it opens them up to all sorts of demonic influence, basically. And these beings that come over are not only having an easier time because of the stuff that we put out in the airwaves, but the people have so little consciousness and have so little awareness up, that they're just really easily manipulated. And I see these things coming in and causing drama in the human world all the time, and people are totally unaware of what's going on.
Yeah. So one of the things, like, I always wanted Ryan to come on and talk to on my show, just to have a conversation, because I'm not anybody that knows me is, even though I'm in old school traditional type of shamanism and from my family line, shamanism, I am not a big advocate of, recreational dreaming medicines. And recreational dreaming medicines are, can be ayahuasca, can be, DMT, can be peyote. These medicines actually transport part of your energetic self to other worlds and open doorways that you can have experiences with beings. And in some cases, you can die. You can actually be attacked on the other side, not get back, or come back with things like sleep paralysis, where you have, these demonic type entities that are feeding off of you, or eating off your body while you're awake, watching them while you're in sleep paralysis and things like that. So one of the ways that I met Ryan was he had experienced that. He actually, went into another world, was trafficked by beings that in some ways wasn't prepared to deal with, because, you think you're going to have this experience of God, and then you open yourself wide open, and then you end up, having a friend for life that has moved in. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure.
Because I get a lot of phone calls from parents about their teenagers and stuff going off the deep end after they've done some street or recreational ayahuasca and DMT. And so it's kind of becoming an epidemic. And then they end up, like depression, clinical depression, because they're dealing with beings that they can't really explain to the outside world, because by psychology or psychotherapy, they are considered, completely whacked out of their minds. Okay.
Yeah, so actually in your intro, you were a bit modest about this because, without your help, I was in big trouble. And I did. I got a being that has a link into my field, and that being hasn't gone away. I still experience it from time to time, but you helped me learn how to deal with it and take control of the situation rather than being manipulated and have my energy bled off all the time. And that's really important, is to not keep feeding, if you have something attached to you, to not keep feeding it. And a lot of it is you're feeding it with your emotional reactions to whatever this being does. Is if it's making you angry and you just vent, then you're feeding it your anger. Or if it's making you depressed and you cry, you're feeding it your sorrow, and you're feeding it these energies that it's actually trying to get out of you. That's why it's doing what it's doing. And so you need to really find that center and be able to be sort of stoic about things, and just take a step back and look at this thing and be able to see that it isn't as powerful and as horrible as maybe you think. If you're being really targeted by some demonic entity, it can be frightening. It can be just horrible. And you need to be able to find the detachment, to be able to let that go and not be affected by it, because that perpetuates the situation. So yeah, let's go back to the start of things for me. Not really the start. I mean, my spiritual path is, has its roots long ago, but when I started into this really sorcery and shamanism, this path, I was using some psychedelic drugs and whatever, and I did come in contact with this being that was selling me this vision, right? And it comes back into that because it's the whole sales pitch is sort of, live recreationally, right? The idea that once you reach a certain level of consciousness and you can stop the world, you can stop your ego, you become aware of this choice that exists where, because I'm a Taoist, okay, I consider myself a Taoist Nahualist, and part of my Taoist thinking is really involved in this idea that the internal and external worlds are really just reflections of one another. And that if you... Okay.
Just put the microphone, just hold the microphone here. Just talk right there, the microphone right there. There you go.
Okay, can you hear me better? All right.
You want to get all this.
Excuse me. So, if you fully understand what this whole experience, reality experiment thingy really is, you'll get to understand that, each moment, the self and the other, the subject and the object, are really the same thing. It's all just two sides of the experience of that one moment. And when you're directing your consciousness through this reality, you have some choice in the matter. You can choose to go from one moment to another one, not just in the way that we think of our just normal choices around the daily world. I mean, we can choose to travel on the dreaming plane, but we can also direct our experiences even through this material plane. We can make these choices. This is what lies at the basis of sorcery, and why such ideas as conjuring and manifesting your intent even exists, is because there is a choice when you get down to a certain fundamental. And the temptation is to live recreationally, to choose that next moment that just out of the sheer momentary gratification that it may give you, right? This is kind of chasing the dragon spiritually, right? And this is kind of one of the ways in which these beings will come to you and trap you into their system, is by tempting you with this idea of, well, you can create your own paradise on this world just by, using power, by, doing all of these things to change your reality. Am I not speaking into the correct side of the mic?
I don't know.
Okay. So
Why don't you tell them about some of the things that they've tried to entrap you in and tell you?
So, yeah, it starts out very positive, and you can just go off and choose your own adventure. It's one of you remember those little novels? Yeah, choose your own adventure for life. Just live for the moment, and that's great. But they do manipulate your consciousness. They'll, manipulate you into guilt. They'll manipulate you into, anger, to feeling helpless, to anything that they can use to trap you and bleed off your energy. And so I ended up falling for one of these scams. They and I don't like the word they even, but I got manipulated into feeling into fracturing my own energy into, leaving pieces of myself out of, just a traumatic event that happened on one of these ayahuasca trips, fracturing my energy and coming back incomplete. And, I had left pieces of myself in different places out in, on these other planes, on the astral plane and in the dreaming plane. Just little chunks of my energy got separated from my field, and once that happens, once they've got their foot in the door, it becomes very easy for these beings to start to take advantage of you and to start to torment you. I really had a terrible time for a while before I started getting your help, and so I'll give you one story, and this was actually after I met Bridgette, but I was still in a power struggle with this demonic entity that I had picked up. And so this entity likes to appear as an arachnid, as either a spider, a giant tarantula, or a scorpion, sometimes a scorpion woman. But there was a specific instance. I used to deal with this being every night. Just going into dreaming, I was going to have to deal with this being. And one night, I was struggling with this thing. She was manifesting as a spider, again as a tarantula, and I separated off. I just kind of pulled the segments of her body apart. I was just really done. I had regained enough power to actually fight back, and I was fighting back. And so she responded by biting my heel, my ankle, which, in a funny way, that's sort of biblical, right? Well, she wasn't manifesting as a serpent at that point, but we do get a lot of serpent imagery associated with these kind of beings. In fact, she does manifest as a dragon at times. In this case, it was as a spider biting my foot, and I woke up immediately because I was feeling intense pain in my foot, and so I looked at it, and it was swollen, and there were these two little puncture marks. Now, this is in the physical world. This is the material plane. I was in dreaming, had this experience wrestling around with this thing, and I woke up to find my foot swollen with two little puncture marks, a good 3/4 of an inch apart. It was a really odd type of bite to have. I mean, maybe that spacing would be appropriate for a snake, but not for a spider, not for any kind of thing that could have realistically bit me in my bed. Anyway, I eventually went to the doctor. This thing, I got throbbing pain in this thing, and it was not going away immediately. So I went to the doctor. They called it gout. They told me I had gout, and I was asking about the puncture marks because my foot was all swollen up. It hurt, and it hurt more at night, which is kind of a traditional thing with gout. But they didn't have any explanation to give me about the puncture marks in the foot that had mysteriously appeared at exactly the same time it started hurting. But anyway, so I took their anti-inflammatory, and eventually my foot got better. But I think it was about a week later, or maybe a week or 10 days, somewhere in there, that I had another dream with this spider. And this time, I was living with my mom at the time, and she has a bird. And the spider was in the bird cage, So it was no longer on a human scale. It was now on the scale with the bird, kind of like a more realistic tarantula size. And but it was in the cage, in the bird's cage, and the bird was trying to fight the thing off, and it bit the bird on the wing. And I woke up the next day and not thinking anything of it, but woke up and was walking out to the kitchen to get some breakfast or whatever I was doing. I looked over at the bird, and what's wrong with the bird? The bird had this massive sore, this massive, like, festering wound on her wing all of a sudden. And it turned out to be a tumor. We eventually had the wing amputated. The bird died after that, but this thing was manifesting its malice, right? It wasn't doing anything positive. It was manifesting these attacks physically in the material world. And so these things they're not just psychological. They're not just gonna necessarily just drive you out of your head, but they can actually manifest their intent in your 3D reality. And that's where people can get really frightened when they start to see their lives breaking down over this presence that they don't know, because we're not trained. We're not trained how to operate, how to even think about these things. In our culture, we don't know what to do with it. And it can really be overwhelming. And, certainly it can drive you to thoughts of suicide, just trying to get away from what's going on. And unfortunately, we have there's no safety net, there's no support structure for people who catch these entities in our culture, because our official line is blah, 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 blah. We just want to deny their existence. We don't want to acknowledge that there is even a thing that is going on.
Yeah. So I just want to add, like, even a lot of the churches, one of the things is, I always tell people, is I come from two old bloodlines, and one of the bloodlines was on my family side. And so I've been dealing with, if you want to call it demonic or multi-dimensional being stuff since I was a little girl. I was first approached when I was 4 years old. And then I saw my first one removed by my grandmother, who was a prophet and also an exorcist. And so I have the shamanism background. So I have a lot of background with dealing with these kinds of things. And I do at times go through periods where I get a lot of calls about it. Sometimes too, if you're really prone as a child to be psychic, sometimes you can travel to some of these other planes and visit. When I was a kid, I used to be able to stare at something long enough that I would travel through the molecular structure of it. So I could literally stare at a sheet, and I would keep going deeper and deeper into the fabric until I would get to like an atom or a molecule. And then I could go through there, and then I could travel. When I was 9, I actually woke up to my sister on the top bunk, having been thrown off, and blood everywhere. My sister's face cut open from one side to the other because of the fall and what she fell on by one of these beings. So, and the bunk bed was, secure, had a fence on it. She was on the upper one. So these things happen. It's just becoming more. I think now that a lot of people are using dreaming medicines in the wrong way, without the proper ceremonies, without the proper protections. A lot of the medicine people or shamans, they are trained to make sure that if you take the dreaming medicines, that it's, used for healing. And so they end up traveling usually with you and carrying the songs and the medicine to keep the protection. I mean, the Tibetan Buddhists are kind of the same way. They have lots of different chants, especially for when the monks, decide to die and they decide to leave their bodies. they have 90 days worth of chants and songs so that the monk knows exactly where he's at in the cycle, trying to outrun the heaven experience, or the tractor beam called heaven, which is another entrapment in prison by different sets of beings. So one story I was just going to add, and then the reason why I always tell people, one of the things I always tell people when I get these calls is that now that you've, trafficked yourself into another, reality, you're probably always going to have some kind of contact with that reality, and you may not be consciously aware of it. But one of the most powerful, like, mainstream things is The Art of Dreaming, that was written by Carlo Castaneda. And people can poo-poo it for all they want, but I did a whole bunch of dreaming work based on Carlo Castaneda's work for about 6 years, in order to, be able to reach what would be called the fourth attention, which means that you are conscious and awake and maneuvering yourself, whether you're dreaming or you're awake, and it's all simultaneously. So that you know exactly what you're engaged in, you know exactly where you're going, and you're not haphazardly sailing along in a mindless thing. In our society, a lot of people want to get away from being responsible for what they're thinking and feeling, and a lot of people just want to check out, and they think if they do some of these drugs and they open themselves up wide open, that everything's going to be okay. And sometimes it can be, sometimes it can be a revelation, and then sometimes it can be hell. People come back with things that they are never going to really be able to get rid of. Exorcisms don't work on some of these things because they're not trying to possess somebody's body. They're more of a hitchhiker and piggybacking. So I had a guy call me. This was about 2 years ago. Oh, actually, there's two stories I want to tell, and then I'll let Ryan talk. But so about a year ago, maybe it was about a year and a half ago, I get a call from a guy who lives down in Vegas, and I ended up sending him to my friend Bear, who was on my show a couple weeks ago, to help him with his entity. But he was given some pharmaceutical drugs, are actually some of the worst things that people can take, because a lot of it blocks the neuron transmitter, which blocks the relationship between the body and the brain. And then they get trafficked by beings, even if they don't believe in this stuff, until these things kind of break them down enough that they can like move in and start controlling, like a host parasite kind of relationship. But the guy was really heavy. The doctor put him on a drug. I can't remember the name of it. And he took the drug for about 6 months. And then the doctor said, well, we're just going to up the drug because, you need to lose weight a little bit faster. So he started taking, double doses of the drug, which the doctor said wasn't, a big deal. And then he started to notice this being, and he was at work, and he felt something going around him. And then he felt it attach itself to the bottom of his chair at his desk, and that it would move around the chair all day while he was sitting there, because it was trafficking him. It was like working on him and trying to, find a way in. And then the thing finally like attached itself onto him after about a 3-month, curiosity kind of a thing with this thing, and him thinking that, maybe he was losing his mind. And then he decided to look at some of the labeling of the drug, and the drug said that it would cause hallucinations. So the guy got off the drug, and his hallucinations continued, and he was an atheist. And what he said to me was that he never had believed in these things before, and that there's no way that it could be the drug anymore, and that maybe the drug opened up the energy field in order for it to come, but now it's stuck on him, and he can't seem to thwart it or get it off. And, you just think about sitting there all day at work while you're trying to deal with this, trying to make money. And eventually what happens to people is when they realize they have these things and there's no one that they can turn to. The saddest part is watching them, the reality that they thought existed they're happy ever after. Oh, I'm going to get married. I'm going to have 2.5 kids. I'm going to have a career. I'm going to have a white picket fence. I'm going to go to Greece and swim the ocean on vacation. You know, all of the whole life and potential of the 3D world, you know, comes to a screeching halt. And for a lot of people, that's, I think, the emotional component that almost destroys them, that they're never going to be able to live that life, and that life really doesn't exist. And I think sometimes that can damage people in a way where they can't recover and they can't move forward. But anyway, so he went down, and my friend Bear, because, you know, it's always best to do this stuff kind of in person. So he went down, and Bear helped him, and he actually got rid of his. His was attracted with pharmaceutical drugs, and it wasn't a very strong one. We'll call it kind of like a, I don't know, you know, a goober boogie. So I had another call, and I just want to tell people like the difference in extremity of what can happen. So I had a call from a guy, and I can't really disclose his name. He was in a band. They, you know, toured for a long time, and they got really famous in Hollywood. He relayed to me that he spent a year when they got famous in a lot of satanic stuff, but he had no idea what he was engaging in. It just was fun. There's a lot of nudity and sex and orgies and, you know, ritual stuff. But he said, because you're so hammered and on drugs and whatever else, it's really a big party. And then he reached a point after about a year of fame where he just decided like this kind of lifestyle just was not for him. And so he decided to quit the band and leave. And at that point, some people that were involved with some of this stuff outside of their band basically said, well, there's no possible way that you're going to be able to leave this situation, because, you know, you're basically been given to, you know, this being, blah, 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 which, you know, I don't want to repeat this being's name. Strong, extremely powerful, dominating, you know, demonic entity force, or whatever you want to call it. So he said, yeah, well, whatever, you know, I don't really believe you, and I'm leaving, and, you know, don't threaten me, and, you know, I'm just out of here. I'm just done with this whole scene. So the guy leaves and packs all of his stuff and refuses to play events, and actually goes to a place, a compound in California, Northern California, to kind of recuperate and recover and just get away from it all. Because he was walking away 100%, and he was just trying to sort himself out before, you know, he made those steps. So what happened is that this being showed up in the middle of the night while he was laying in the bed, and the being said basically, like, you are not doing this. I'm going to give you, you know, one attempt to pack your stuff up, head back, rejoin the band. Mind you, this is a multi-dimensional being. And the guy said, no, you know, like, I don't know who you are or what you are, and, you know, I'm not going for it. And the being basically said, well, you're already mine. You know, you already sold yourself, you know, in blood rites and rituals. And that's it. That's the end of the story. So you will do what I want you to do. And he told the being, no, I'm not going to do it, blah, 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 blah. So the being actually grabbed his lower part of his leg and fractured the tibia and fibula so harshly that the bones were sticking out of his leg, and then left him there, watched him bleed and all the blood bleeding out of him, and literally held the door closed. The guy was screaming on the ground. There were people banging on the door, and they couldn't get in the door to get to him. And then right at the last minute, where the being knew that he would survive it if they got him to a hospital, that he would continue to live so he could continue to control him. That's when the moment the door flew open, they got him in, they got him to a hospital. He was given all kinds of blood. And at the time of recovery, when he still had a cast on, he found me, and, you know, we talked about a lot of this kind of stuff, but he was in so much fear that he couldn't listen to, you know, the fact that he needed to regain power, because now this thing had control over whether he lived or died. And I think there's some point where you start working with the dreaming worlds where you start to realize, like, this isn't really living anyway. You know, like, this could be a dream that you're having, like I have a video on my YouTube channel where I talk about what if I'm living on another planet and I'm in a coma and I'm dreaming what I think I'm living now. And maybe it's not even real, maybe it's just a dream that I would be dreaming if I was sleeping at night, like the same kind of thing, and the answer is I don't know. And the only way that I can know is developing, my stages and levels of attention and being able to hold my attention and not losing my attention ever, not in my sleeping state, not in my waking state. In shamanism, I've been trained to learn that I have to combine my dreaming state and my waking state together, because my dreaming state holds, let's just say abilities that I don't believe I have physically when I'm awake. So I can bring more of this floating and flying, and it's proven that Don Guillermo, who was involved with Carlo Castaneda and Don Juan, could fly through the air like a bird. And he was captured on film multiple times doing this before they left this world together with their bodies and they created their own world outside of this world. So only through being able to dream at night can I adapt to bringing some of that magic into my physical world. And then my physical world, I have, technique, language, step one foot in front of the other, different kinds of abilities that I can bring in the dreaming world that can help me to control the dreaming world so it's not controlled. And then there's the multiple levels of dreaming. So you can have, so many different levels of dreaming that you actually take yourself into other realities other than this one. So when we're talking about dreaming, we're not always talking about the night dream and just going to sleep. We're talking about working really hard with practices, learning how to be awake during that dreaming process, monitoring everything that's happening to us, and then being able to live in a multi-dimensional world, going into multi-dimensions and stuff like that while we're dreaming, but just like if we were awake during the day. And so we're in control, we understand it, and we have mechanisms to pull ourselves out if we need to. But a lot of this has to do with the left and the right brain, and your critical ability to critically think and ask questions and problem solve, and not just let yourself be taken away haphazardly. And this is what happens with alcohol and drugs, whether it's illegal or pharmaceutical, or if we would just want to go to sleep and we just want to sleep it off. We're giving our power away. We're giving everything away to be controlled on lots of different levels that we just really, most people couldn't even begin to understand. So I'm going to let Ryan back on, and maybe he has some stuff to add because he's over here nodding, and I can see his rat on his wheel turning. Okay, here you go.
Well, I want to respond to all of that. It looks like we don't have long before the break, so I'll probably just respond to the story about the guy in the band, and then for the second half we'll get on to everything that you just said after that, because I want to talk about all of those things. But it is when you end up in some relationship with a non-physical entity that through whatever means has acquired some amount of power over you, some leverage, it's important to remember that you also are a higher dimensional being. You need to be able to go inward and step into your power in that way and say, no, I'm not being manipulated this way. Because when you understand your role in creating your own reality, your role in manifesting what is, there's really no reason to allow that power inside of you to be manipulated by these forces that aren't on your side. It just, when you realize that what's happening when you have a demonic entity, say, attached to your field, and it's doing something. It seems to be doing something. All it's doing is co-opting your power, in order to bother you, in order to be a menace. And you have to come back to center, rediscover your own divine nature, and say no. Right? You have to be able to find that spot inside your own power, and stand up for, no, I'm not going to allow you to project this negativity into my world. No, I am at the center of my reality, and you don't get to call the shots. I'm not going to give you my power. So really, really acknowledging what we are fundamentally. We're not limited humans. We're very powerful perceivers. We are conduits. We are manifestations of the spirit, of the divine, and there's no reason we should allow our reality to be corrupted by these things. But we need to step into our power. We need to step into our purity of who and what we truly are at our core, and realize, no, I'm a higher dimensional being too. You have no place trying to coerce me into, bad reactions or losing it, or you have no place even corrupting my reality to make me feel not at home in my home, because the universe is my home. Anyway, so
Let's see, hold on. You have like 4 minutes.
Okay. Well, so when I talk about stepping into the center of your reality, what I mean is your reality is in your head. And let's just start there. Let's start with the basic. Is if you take a scientific point of view, I may be looking at a yellow car out the window here, but what's happening, according to our physical interpretation, some photons have left the sun, are bouncing off the paint on this vehicle, and are striking my retina. Yeah, right, hitting some cones, sending a signal up my optic nerve into my brain, which gets decoded, blah, blah, blah. My only perception, my only sense of any of that is actually the signal in my brain. Well, where's me? which neuron is me in the brain, right? Where's the command booth? Where's the cockpit that I think we need to understand that experience is something a little more than mechanical, right? That even when we break this thing down into neural signals in the brain, that we are losing something because, well, a computer, right, a circuit board processes electrical impulses in a similar manner to the way that the brain does. Of course, it's a much more simple circuit, but the actual experience is not necessary. There's no need for the experience. The experience happens because fundamentally we are spirit. We are not. We're not just meat puppets, right? We're not just these biological automatons. We are actually conscious, and Anyway, so I see this yellow car. The yellow car is not really there.
So you'll be able to hear the commercial. Put that in your ear.
Okay. The yellow car isn't there. What is there is energy. And the best we can say is energy seems to be relational. I see the photon hitting my eye as part of a relationship that energy has with itself. But the whole car, the thing that I see, the yellow car, is a construct that I have invented in my brain. Or rather, I'd rather not say in my brain, in my mind. I'm projecting that image, that shape, all of its properties with my mind and manifesting it into my reality. And I think I'm going to have to cut off there. Yeah.
I took some notes, so I'll start off with that same idea of kind of.
Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.
And build a vocabulary, stuff.
Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm of spirit brought into our matrix of truth. With your host, the Solaris Blue Raven. Solaris will bring you an array of unique guests covering topics from ghostly spirits to amazing anomalies, covert technology, UFOs, and shadowy global events.
And that's right here, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Saturdays midnight till 2 a.m. Eastern Time. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Let the magic rise.
This is Barbara DeLong, host of Nightlight Radio, inviting you to join me on a cosmic journey, exploring a metaphysical montage of spiritual material, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between, including spiritual readings for those who seek enlightenment. Let Nightlight provide you with equal measure of light, love, and laughter, insight, wisdom, and inspiration. Monday nights, 10 to 12 p.m. Eastern, right here on Studio B, Revolution Radio, at freedomslips.com.
And if you don't know it, you ain't getting out even when you die. Just taking his food to some
The
other
opinions
planet.
expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hey, it's Bridgette Lyn Dolgoff, your host of Carrying Stones and Digging Holes radio show. Today, my guest is Ryan Hunter, who is a good friend of mine. And like I said, we explore and talk a lot about, heavy duty consciousness. Consciousness that is way out of the norm, even for consciousness and exploration. So just want to say that we are listener supported. And you can find my show and information about my show at Studio A on Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And you can go to Studio A schedule, and you can scroll down to the 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slot, and you will see my show there with a big old bee and pollen on his legs flying towards a flower. And then that'll give you some more information about how to find me, find my websites and everything else. Also, while you're there, you may want to explore our funding area since we are listener supported. We have seeds. We have awesome heirloom seeds. We have banner advertising that's affordable. So if you have a business, you may want to advertise your business on Revolution Radio. Also, we have just a funding area, and you can just flatly donate if that's what you feel like you should do. So lots of different ways to actually support us and all of our hosts and all of our work that all of us are doing and bringing to the forefront in our each individual reality or our constructs of reality. Okay, so I just wanted to touch base on a couple of things, and then I'm going to let Ryan roll on it. This is his first time being on radio, so it's always kind of, interesting, getting the words out of your mouth that are in your mind. I know that just as well as anybody else. So I was thinking about, if he was talking about, the construct of what we see the car, but that's, an image that may not be our own image of the situation that's going on, and specifically like the color of the car. And because all of this stuff was programmed in you the moment you popped out. So some of the first things that you learn is numbers: 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C. These are things that are repetitively over and over and over again filling your mind until you can develop and learn it so that you can fit in society and you can go to the school system. Oh, it's the helicopter. I'm sure they've spotted me. No. They're always following me around, those damn helicopters. But, so we're programmed over and over and over again with what things are, and in preparation to go to school, which is like free daycare where, the school can actually program us into more solid belief systems in this world. So yellow would be a controlled color because there's yellow in every language. So it doesn't matter what language you speak, you learn what yellow is. So the yellow car. So once you look at it, you go, oh, look, there's yellow because it's in your established 3D reality belief system. Oh, and it's a car. Oh, and look, it's by itself in a parking lot. Okay, well, all of those things because you have been taught to know. So it actually is like glasses keeping you from broader awarenesses of things going on around you, or even being able to, keep yourself safe because you can't monitor your perception that is all the way around you and maybe, 21 feet out, right? Because you're so focused in on getting it right. Well, what is that? Yellow. What is that? Car. What is that? Parking lot. So this is what your mind is like wrapped up in while all these other things are going on simultaneously that you're not aware of. So also, I'm going to let Ryan talk, but also one of the things that we talk about usually in the physical world, and it's one of my favorite things with Don Juan Matus from Carlo Castaneda's book, is the petty tyrant. So all of these things that we're dealing with in our reality are petty tyrants that are teaching us how to have critical thinking, and how learn not to react to our environment to give it, more power. So the petty tyrant is considered, I believe in Don Juan's books, to be one of the most important lessons that there is. Every time you're confronted with a petty tyrant, a bill, your power bill, your mortgage bill, all these different things could be petty tyrants. And so looking at them and not giving any of it power, don't give it any power over you, because this is how things get in and operate you. And, they have other people, do something to your bank account, And then now you're reacting like a crazy person, right? Because now all your bills are bouncing and all this other stuff is happening. It's like it's cooperative. People are easily manipulated and controlled. They make technical mistakes because there are other beings trafficking them and they don't know it. And they go through a system of doing harm or creating mischief. So we have to learn how really not to respond to a lot of the stuff that's going on in our environment. But anyway, I'm going to let Ryan talk for probably the next hour because his mind is, his rat is on his wheel. Okay, here you go.
Okay, so yeah, of course, as soon as I mentioned the yellow car, it pulled away. But the idea is that that energy exists in some form, whether it's, my reality is a dream and it's just a projection of energy in my own mind, or, whether our usual physical interpretation of all of the protons and neutrons and electrons that are spinning around madly in order to create this physical object. The point is that all of its attributes are things that I give it. Its color, yellow, its shape, form, function. In fact, space and time are merely mental constructs. We think this reality is, something concrete that sits in three real spatial dimensions and one real temporal dimension. Actually, there is no space. There's just energy reacting with other energy. And you create space when you learn to assemble your perception. So this is what Bridgette was talking about. Actually, before we even learn to count and before we even learn language, we are taught to assemble this world. We're taught how to take our raw perceptions, because just think of all the nerve endings in your body, all of the sensory input that goes into your brain. That's just raw data. Right? If we think about it of your central nervous system as being like a computer system, that's just the raw input. We have to learn how to assemble that raw input into a sensible reality in which we can, interpret things and make reasonable judgments about what's going on around us. That's the very first thing that we learn to do as infants, is construct this reality. We learn to construct space, right? We can't actually perceive space. We have to construct it in our minds. We model reality with this three-dimensional construct. Time is the same thing. The future and the past are fantasies. They don't exist. There's only one moment. But we create these chronologies with our minds. And, we create the past as a convenient story to tell ourselves in order to account for our inexplicable presence in the moment. And the future is just a projection forward because we think there was a backward. Neither one is real. And that's kind of, that actually touches back to something that Alan Watts used to say, is the lesson that you should have learned before 1, 2, 3 and ABC, before all of those beginning linguistic lessons and learning number concepts and what have you, is that is the concept of a polar unity, is that black can't exist without white. They're the same phenomenon. Is that if you have a property, if you have any quality that you observe in your constructed reality, it's just, again, it is a mental quality, right? It's an aspect of reality that you're projecting into your construct. And they work, but they work, they're not isolated things. A thing and its opposite are mutually dependent on one another. And you can't have hot without cold. Actually, let's use hot and cold for a second. Because if you, again, go back to our strictly physical interpretation of reality, which is very obtuse, by the way, but, there are a lot of people who are very grounded into, unless science says it, it's not so. But if we think about what heat and cold are, it's a measure of random kinetic energy, random molecular motion. And, so cold is a measure of the stillness of things, and heat is the measure of the, intense random motion, right? But when you break it down, if you look at this spectrum, like we think in Western thought, we look at these things as a spectrum. We look at it as a dialectic, as a two-sided thing. There's hot and there's cold, and there's the interplay between them is a continuum, right? But if you go all the way to cold, if you reach absolute zero, then the molecular structure just disappears. It disintegrates because there's no longer enough energy, enough kinetic energy in the system to even sustain this structure of matter. On the other extreme, if you go to trying to create more and more heat, you take your matter and you heat it and heat it and heat it. Eventually, what it does is you get a fusion reaction, and again, the structure of matter breaks down. All of those heavy particles condense down into one big thing and release a massive amount of energy. Whereas at absolute zero, the structure of the matter broke down and it had to revert to pure energy. And so, yeah, if you heat this matter from absolute zero all the way up to, whatever its fusion temperature is, run the whole gambit, there's going to be an energy differential, just the amount of energy you had to put into the system to do that. But those two extreme states are not really different states, right? The extreme of hot and the extreme of cold really just come down to, matter breaks down and reverts to pure energy. And so really what polar unity, rather than thinking in terms of Western dialectics of spectrum with two extreme points, if we look at those extreme points, because they're ideal states, they're not real, but if we look at them and identify them as the same thing because they're not different, and I just chose one example, but the extremes of any two apparently opposites are the same. If it's white and black, the extreme of white or extreme of black, there's no contrast, so it's no color. Either way, there is no color if there's no contrast. And so if you identify the two extreme points on your continuum, it turns into a circle. And this is the Taoist concept of a polar unity, where it's no longer a spectrum, and that takes away the idea of, there being some imperative to get to one side or the other of the spectrum.
Same with the native people, the circle.
Right. So the circle, all points on the circle are equal, and you're just at the spot where you are. You don't have to. There's no need for recrimination. There's no need to try to become something other than what you are, and try to do anything other than follow where the spirit leads you.
No past or future. Zero.
But because we have this dialectic, which makes it seem like, things are separate, like there's, hot is different than cold, that, we need to increase the heat then, or whatever the case may be. We always feel like we need to fix it. right? Like we're on a mission, we're on a crusade to get from one end of the spectrum to the other, rather than being content where we are. And so that's a little bit of a tangent there, but the concept of a polar unity, when you really grasp it, fundamentally changes your outlook on what reality is. And getting back to what I was saying at the beginning about the internal and the external being reflections of one another, this ties back into what I'm talking about in terms of you project mentally when you construct your reality because it exists in your mind. Again, what you think is so concrete and physical exists within your mind. And when you project that reality, when you construct it, it becomes a reflection of what's inside of you, just by the nature of that projection. And in fact, the inside, the internal, is equivalently a projection of what's outside of you. All of those forces that have come to bear upon you and to mold you into what you are then manifest. And so it's sort of like if you had two spheres and you had a mirroring. So these are two nested spheres. One's inside of the other, and the inner sphere has mirroring on the outside, and the outer sphere has mirroring on the inside. And so they just reflect back and forth. And you can ask, what's the image that appears on the mirrored surface? Well, I mean, there's two mirrored surfaces, but they have to be reflecting each other. So there's only one image. And that the answer, of course, is subject to what light exists in that, vacuum. Whatever light was incident on these mirrored surfaces when the thing was constructed will kind of play out into some pattern, into some evolving image on these two spheres. And that's kind of a metaphor for what I mean in the sense that there's the internal and external are reflections of one another. It's a feedback loop, and it's what actually Douglas Hofstadter would call a strange loop, which, being a mathematician, I'm a fan of Douglas Hofstadter. Not sure if many of your listeners have heard of him or read his work, but I'll give you one example. What he calls a strange loop, and it comes back to the work of M.C. Escher and an etching called The Drawing Hands, which I think most people have seen, which is depicts two hands, each holding a pencil. I think it's a pencil or maybe a pen, but they're drawing each other into existence. So they're drawn hands that are coming out of a piece of paper and creating one another, right? And so there's no, it's sort of a self-generating process. There's no beginning and no end. It's completely bent in on itself, and this is what he calls a strange loop. But the fact is that's the nature of perception. It is a strange loop. It has no beginning and no end. It generates itself out of nothing, and that's the nature of the spirit. That's really what we are. That's what's so amazing when you get in touch with your divinity inside. It's so flabbergasting how amazing we are. It's just where we come from. We generate consciousness out of nothing. When you get in touch with that inside of you, then you can begin to get in touch with your personal power and start to actually take command of aspects of your life. I'm not trying to advocate, well, the law of attraction, and you attract whatever you're project. Well, you know what? Sometimes there are things that are just going on. It's not always you. But as you step into your power, recall who and what you are, and begin to take responsibility for who and what you are. Take responsibility for your experience. So this is getting back to the question you asked at the very beginning, which I mentioned is something that I probably would want to touch on, is the difference between ethics and morality. And morality is what we're all brought into in terms of thinking, well, you're just a loose cannon. You're fundamentally flawed because human nature is fundamentally flawed. And so you need a bunch of rules to contain you and prevent you from hurting other people. And so it's an attempt to take responsibility for everybody else's experience and protect them from your own, inner waywardness. But it's not doable. I can't take responsibility for your experience. Only you can do that. If I say something that happens to offend you, I'm sorry, but you made that choice, And so ethics is kind of the reverse thing. It's all about taking responsibility for your own experience, knowing that I can't take responsibility for your experience, and you may say something. I have the choice to get offended about it or not. That's my responsibility. That's my ethics. Is I can fly off the handle, or I can take a breath and go, okay, let's work this out. But people don't want to take responsibility for themselves. They don't even want to actually face up to themselves. We're so occupied in this culture with running away from our own selves, our inner being, who and what we are, that we can't take responsibility for ourselves because we don't even want to know that guy. Like, this is why people are so desperate. I mean, I really see it a lot with the relationship thing, with especially now that it's all gone online dating, and people are just like, as soon as one thing is over, they are desperate to get back into a relationship because they can't live with themselves. They're bad company for themselves, and it's because they've never actually confronted themselves. Isn't it? They're afraid because they're afraid of the unknown, and they are the unknown because they've never even faced up to themselves. And
never live their life by choice.
And that you can't take responsibility for your own actions if you can't even face up to who and what you are. And when you discover your own divinity within, when you start to wake up your heart, then you begin to, first of all, become aware that you are what you are. And all I can really do is just play out my inner nature in this reality. All I can do is be true to myself. That's the only choice that I have. And whatever circumstances arise, all I can do is play it out as I would. If I try to be somebody else, that's when things are going to get really screwed up. If I'm not true to myself, if I sacrifice my integrity, then I start causing problems. And this is really the fundamental problem we see in our society is people have been totally okay with sacrificing their integrity in order to play their part, in order to be the cog in that part of the system, because they're dependent on it and they think they need it to live. They want to get ahead. Well, actually, they may just want to sustain, hold their spot in society, or they may even be trying to get ahead because that's what our our whole society and money system is really geared to do, is to turn greed from a vice into a virtue. All of those things that we value money, right? It's our form of social power, and because we're set up to work for money rather than working for the product, rather than being creative in order to do what you're doing, we're being creative out of a monetary incentive. And so our whole creativity as a society is motivated by money. That's the way the system's set up. Right. There are a few carrots that they dangle in front of us: money, fame, sex, whatever. But we're all taught to try to get one up on everybody else, and we're all scrambling around to try to screw each other over. And is it any wonder you take greed and try to make a virtue out of it? Is it any wonder that we end up in a society that is this screwed up?
All right, so just to let people know, we are doing this interview together in my traveling van. So we're passing the microphone back and forth because sometimes you just got to do what you got to do because the show must go on. All right. But one of the things that Ryan said earlier that was kind of hit me was he used a word: we have to assemble our reality. And so, as kids, maybe halfway. Hold on, we're trying to control the noise, but not, oh, that's good, not cook in the van at the same time. So that is the perfect world. Perfect word. It was assemble your construct of your reality. And so I was thinking about Legos that they give kids, or blocks, or all these other things. And what they're doing is they're teaching them how to construct a physical reality with the focus constructing there, instead of maybe putting on a meditation tape and letting your 2-year-old hang out in the house while there's these thoughts of consciousness that can help them drift off into consciousness and actually swim in it, instead of constructing a physical reality that they can live in with the thoughts of fitting in, power, security, all these other things that are that we are forced to comply in. One of the things I know is sometimes I come across people that are extremely controlling, but what it comes down to is jealousy, and they're jealous of maybe the work you do or what's happening in your life because they're so stuck in their construct, but they can't stop and actually feel what they actually feel. They're more reactive, like reptiles, and they start to attack you, discredit you, tear your life down because you won't comply. You won't comply to the system and the construct that is. So we have these reactive outputs towards this world, even though we're driven to only accept this reality and, play in it so that we can have everything that everybody else has. Meanwhile, entrapping ourselves further and further in. And, the smallest thing becomes a major, major emotional deal. You can't pay your mortgage. Instead of looking at it maybe this is a gift, maybe this trigger and this petty tyrant of the bank, threatening me and causing a lot of insanity on my part, pushing me to the brink that I may go out and assault somebody else, or, I'm going to live homeless or on the streets or whatever else. Maybe to look at it as an opportunity that you're actually going to become free. And what may happen from that, instead of the loss of your whole world, and that you should commit suicide because you can't even do the basic thing like everybody else, which is pay a mortgage. So the thing is that the system that we're constructing, or that we've been taught to assemble our reality, assemble our thoughts and our perception in, is still in control of us. We never are going to have freedom. And the more that you fight against it, like you said, you're going from one side of the spectrum to the other. One side of the spectrum is I'm in compliance. The next side of the the spectrum is I'm not conforming and I'm going to fight against, and it's the same exact energy that is circulating that means nothing. It means absolutely nothing, and becoming like someplace else where you just kind of elevate yourself out of all of it and maybe gain the ability to look down on yourself and look down on the role that you're playing from a broader perspective. So anyway, just I love that assembling our construct. So it's so what they do to us.
Yeah. Actually, I like what you said. Fighting the system doesn't work any better than complying with the system, because you're still acknowledging the system, and the system does not exist. The system is itself just a construct. It is just a fantasy. It's like the money system itself, in the sense that, okay, we have this fiat currency, right? We know that the dollar isn't backed by gold or anything else. It's, backed by the word of the Federal Reserve, which is worthless. And so we have this paper that we transact everything with. Actually, we're not really using paper anymore, but let's say paper that is our holder for value, right? It's our monetary token, but it's inherently worthless. I mean, you can wipe your ass with it, but that's about it. There's not a whole lot to be done with this paper currency intrinsically for what it is. It is the value that people believe it has that gives it value, right? It's completely a fantasy. It's glass castles in the sky, but because everybody's going along with the fantasy, it kind of works out. Well, the same thing with government. The system does not actually exist. It takes your participation, and guess what? Anti-participation is still participation, because you're acknowledging the idea that this thing even has power over you. If you're protesting the government, you're saying, please be a nicer slave master. That's Max Egan's line. I'm not going to take credit for that, but that's you're asking the government, please be a nicer slave master. You're still acknowledging that you're beholden to do what the government is telling you. Well, the government has no real authority. It has no actual legitimacy to telling you what to do with your life. It's only the threat of violence that backs up what the government is saying. And the system is not real. We prop up the system with our belief. And so acting against the system oftentimes does no more good than acting in compliance with it, because you're still acknowledging that they have power over you, which is the fundamental lie. So what you see in this system, because you were talking about petty tyrants, and that's what the system is. In Toltec tradition, right, in Nahualism, we have this term, the tyrant. Actually, if you go back to, I forget which book, maybe The Fire Within was the Castaneda book, where he introduced the concept of the petty tyrant. Don Juan talks about the tyrant as this kind of being, and then all human tyrants are just petty tyrants, because they're really not worth a damn. There's kind of one being that is the tyrant, the big one, and then everybody else is a petty tyrant. And the key to the petty tyrant was, when you learn how to deal with the human tyrants in your life, you've learned the lessons, the principles that will allow you to get by the tyrant. And so I want to talk about the tyrant for a minute, because every tradition has its own term for this being. And we talk about the matrix as being this whole system that we're living in, this kind of soul prison that we get trapped into in this lifetime. Yeah,
by
yeah,
physical
yeah, yeah.
expression.
Exactly. So what that system is, well, I just said it's a prison system for souls. Well, the prison warden is the tyrant, right? This is the tyrant system, or the satanic system, in Gnosticism. So it's become popular, right? Since the Nag Hammadi scrolls came out, the whole Gnosticism thing has become popular. David Icke has actually changed his script from reptilians to archons, right? It's a big move. But in the Gnostic system, they called the tyrant the demiurge. So demiurge means, it's Greek for creator, but not creator in the sense of, creator God, like in our monotheistic traditions, but actually like an artisan, like a tradesperson who fashions something. And but they considered the demiurge to be an evil deity who creates this reality as an illusion in order to trap us, in order to deceive us. And this is the same being, and again, in all traditions have some reference to this being. But what's interesting is, if you actually look at some of these monotheistic traditions, the Christians, the Muslims, many Jews are really, if you look at what they are worshiping the tyrant. This is the creator that they are praying to, because it's the creator that makes a bunch of rules. It's the creator that said, okay, back in Genesis, I've created man, but you're not good enough. I don't like, the inner nature that I created you with, so I'm going to give you a bunch of rules that go against the grain, that go against that nature, that you have to abide by, or I'm going to, condemn you to eternal damnation.
Yeah, there's in one of Carlo Castaneda's books, and I have a quote on my computer, but since I'm not home, I can't bring it up. But basically, Don Juan says, Carlo Castaneda repeats kind of the teachings of Don Juan, but he says, Don Juan says the big problem here with the tyrant is that the tyrant created you and is in your mind and is in part of you. And so you have to learn how to, not give the tyrant that has been created in you power as well, in order to have power against all things. So anyway, just contribute.
Right. And that's, again, what we call the foreign installation, or the foreign mind, right? And this is one of the key aspects to meditation, to cultivating inner silence. Is one of the very first steps is we need to actually learn how to distinguish our own thoughts from the thoughts that get projected into our minds, because we have been controlled. We have been mind controlled. And a lot of people focus on the ways in which the government attempts to mind control people, but it's actually part of a much larger scheme. In fact, what we look at when we look at this material world, and we look at the human system, when we're talking about the Matrix, it's not just the material world. It is a much bigger thing that extends through the different planes. And what we see in the human world is the manifestation of the satanic system of that matrix in the material plane. But it exists through the lower planes, and some of the beings that are really at the center of contriving our world and manipulating people and mind controlling people. They're not human beings. They come from a different plane. They come from a different vibrational frequency, and they're affecting our world here for their own purposes. Obviously, they don't have the human good. If you just look out at the world, for a minute, you'll see that they don't have human good in their hearts.
Also, I just kind of wanted to add is that, in biology, in science, blah, 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 they also talk about the reptilian, part of our brain. It's the oldest part of our brain that exists. And it's where our reactive state comes from. So flight, fight, freeze, how we've been constructed to react to the world. And so when we're in a situation where we're outer reacting, we are in no way, shape, or form conscious, or we're not even conscious of what's going on with us or what's going on in our world, and we're just reacting to it. So even biologically, our physical material has the foreign body, the foreign agents, and the tyrant that is embedded in us and runs our brain if we let it.
And so it's that very foreign installation, the foreign mind, that the tyrant uses to talk to you and to try to deceive you. And so when I was talking earlier about they convince you of, whatever, you've done something, you're guilty, you need to be punished, or they convince you that your world is out of balance and you need to do this, that, and the other. They have all kinds of games, but it's the tyrant's game, and he uses his mind, his foreign installation, into your mind in order to trick you into falling for his little traps. Because what always will happen is that foreign mind will seem to make a legitimate point, and you'll start to give an agreement, and immediately that is taken as a concession of power. That is how they operate. And when you concede your power, you just digging yourself further and further into a hole that you have more and more power to manipulate your mind and trick you into further and further concessions.
So if you want to look at the concession or the initial agreements, one of the things that we have in this world is called contracts and contract law. And that is everybody wants to get in contract, right? Because you have to sign a contract to rent a house. You got to sign a contract to, be a movie star. You got to sign a contract to make a record deal. You got to sign a contract to pay the IRS. You fill out their contract form every year. So this, down on the very even physical level, this is where they get an omission of agreement from you to do the things that they choose to do. And we could say it's a he or a she, or what the main tyrant is, or the designer, or one of the designers of these worlds, or this world that they're in control of, that we allow this to happen by agreement, even the most subtle agreement. Like you hear these pedophiles say things like, well, how did you get the child to agree to have sex? Well, they didn't say anything. Okay, so by omission of not saying anything, not being vocal at all, that was the permission you needed, that they weren't going to fight against you or make a stand, that you could just beat them up and rape them and completely, harm them. So you have to watch where your omission of agreement to participate is and where you're losing your power, because it's a multi-world thing. It's a multi-dimensional thing. It's reverberates through all. One of my teachers when I was 23, a Lakota Sioux medicine woman who was unbelievable what she could do. She had been kidnapped by NASA, then she escaped. Lots of stuff by the time I studied with her. But she said we live in 64 dimensional, like reality. And like I said, we're trying to do this from the van. And so there's hot August nights going on. So people racing up and down with their cars. So hopefully you'll forgive for the background noise. But she said we live, in a 64 dimensional layer construct. And that can mean, for example, that whatever is controlling it or designing it down to the base level also has their foot in all of it, right? So the flower of life pattern, right? What is that? What is it? A 64 is what is that? A hedron? He's better at the whole geometrical lingo over here than I am. But so, and every part of it has an operational field in space where the tyrant, can imply its will. And so my teacher used to say that when I started studying energetic work with her, and energetic medicine is what I call it, she said, we can even have 350 different beings who just help us to manage the energy of a liver in our physical body from these 64 dimensional layers. And within every of these layers, like you said, we have the extreme of both sides in there. You can't have black without white. So even in the multi-dimensional layers, or these 64 dimensional vibrational, however you want to look at it, that's operating, there's a lot going on in them that we can't even begin to wrap our minds around. And so on a very physical level, when we're making agreements and giving our power away here, it's a whole computer, like holographic system, dimensional system that goes out through 64 layers in all the different ways that they can form, all the different beings in there, just operating from our physical world. We're not talking about all the other operating systems that go past this. So it can be, if we give agreement here in any way, shape, or form, we're giving agreement to all of it. So we have to be really careful about, what is our position, what is our stand, getting over the fear of dying. I mean, because that's really the only things that they really can really threaten people with. It really is incarceration, taking away your home, your bank accounts, all these other things to get you to comply to your whole energetic system to be used in whatever way that they will. And usually it's a really derogatory energy so that they can keep their feeding frenzy alive, I guess.
Right, and oftentimes this is not an agreement that you were consciously making. They trick you into this agreement, and it may be on a subconscious level. You may acknowledge, you hear your foreign mind say something, and you say, oh, well, there's some truth in that. First of all, you think it's your own self thinking to yourself. And you acknowledge, oh, well, maybe I have to consider that point. And that's enough. That's enough to get their foot in the door, is I'll consider that, which is just a fair-minded approach. But they use it to manipulate a sense of agreement. And they will use that agreement to take power from you. And so this whole system is about power, and it's about hierarchy, because it carries through the tyrant's signature. What is his nature? Tyranny. He wants to lord it over his own reality. He wants to be a god. That's why he's a tyrant. He's not the true creator. He's not ultimately the creator, the being that created the universe, but he created his own little microcosm, his own little mock universe, and decided to play God over that, to be the Lord over the little beings in his soul trap that he's made. And then the structure carries down. The structure becomes hierarchical, because then every one of the beings in his system, once they get a little bit of power, they use that to lord it over anybody lower, anybody with less power. And that's how you see our human world being structured. And again, because this material plane is kind of we look at it as a dividing plane, right, between what's traditionally called heaven and hell, right, the lower planes and the upper planes. And certainly if you look to the human world, you will find the reflection of hell. But if you look to nature, you'll find the reflection of heaven. They both exist here. You can still see the reflection of sort of both sides of the equation. And again, the two sides are just two sides of the same coin. It's another polar unity. Even light and darkness, we think, we like to get into this rhetoric of, fighting for the light or, being, but actually what we should be seeking is balance. And that's what shamanism is traditionally about, is balancing the upper and lower worlds. It's not about trying to make the upper worlds dominate, right? It's not about choosing sides. It's about finding harmony.
Yeah, so the thing is, like, one of the things that walking the Red Road and studying with lots of different Native people, it's more about the 4 directions and the 7 directions and your placement in the center of it, and not reacting but staying in a neutral place and allowing whatever is going to allow to play out, because we are not going to be able to control what is going on, which is like a preconditioned, foreign implant into most everybody's brain and how that system is playing out. But what we can do is we can stop reacting to it by standing in the center of our own medicine wheel, instead of on a seesaw where, we're being flung back and forth from one side of the polarity to the other, or one side of the duality to the other. But we stay within the circle, the center of the circle, in our place there, where everything is equal and we're not reacting to any of it, but we're allowing ourselves to watch it. So back in the day when I just kind of want to tell the story because it's really funny. So back in the day when I was studying with this Lakota Sioux medicine woman who's just phenomenal, powerful, she had a whole bunch of people because she had been kidnapped by NASA. She had escaped. So during that time, I've been involved. So I'm 50 now. So I've been involved in a lot of this stuff, mostly my entire life, but really got involved with a lot of this kind of power struggle and stuff that was going on when I was 23, when I studied with her for a year. So that's been like 27 years ago. And so a lot of people that were in the underground movements back then, or what we would call whistleblowers, and, they were usually killed way sooner before most of their stuff got out. So I met a lot of really unbelievable amounts of people, from the CIA to scientists to these people to that people. So I used to hang out with them because I would meet them through her. And then, I would go to lunch with them or whatever, just to listen, to what they were doing or what they had been involved in, and what they were whistleblowing. And they would come to her for healing work because she could heal people of anything. Didn't even really matter what it was. Could totally heal you within, an hour or two. So one time I was having lunch with one of these guys who was like this professor, and he also liked to read tarot cards and stuff on the side. Very, very conscious man. And we'd go to have beers and we'd talk about consciousness. And here I am, like, I'm like 23 years old. And one of the things he said to me was, one time he said, "You have fairy tale syndrome." I said, "What? Excuse me?" He goes, "You have this fairy tale, like this Pollyanna, view of the world, and fairy tale syndrome. Like you're just waiting for somebody to come and ride up, with a horse and sweep you off your feet and take you to happy ever after land." And I was like struck by that, because it was like, I probably did have fairy tale syndrome. I mean, part of my construct as a woman in America was get married, have a white dress, find a guy who would marry you, whether it was a symbiotic relationship or not. So I started to realize, and one of the things he said to me, and I said, "Well, what's wrong with, being a Pollyanna or having a fairy tale syndrome?" And he said, "Did you ever question where he would take you?" So you have this thing that, if something comes along and saves you, that it's going to make your life better or help you. But that's not how the tyrant works. Tyrant works on, how they can hook you into their system and your beliefs. And so, you know what? For years I thought about that. I thought about, yeah, you know what? Where would the guy be taking me? So what, a guy rode up on his white horse and going off into the sunset. Well, where's that? I mean, there's no determined contract between me and this person. We haven't really established, you know, where his family's at, where my family's at. We haven't really even looked into this whole thing. But yet I'm looking for a savior. So, you know, we've got the Bible telling us that we need some kind of savior. We can't do it on our own. We have fairy tales that are assembling our construct of, you know, someone will come and save you and take care of you. And then, you know, like this whole new age thing really gripes me because, you know, it's just all of that kind of compiled into another situation where we're looking towards, you know, a benevolent being that wants to like come here and rescue us from our own creation, because we've all been involved with giving our power away and making choices that have, you know, damaged this reality, or damaged people, or harmed people, or starved people because of the choices that we make towards the choices that we feel make us feel better, or that were developed early on in our assembling of our construct.
So yeah, I mean, well, part of the problem with the happily ever after is that you take no responsibility for your own happiness. And okay, that looks like the end. Bye. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, bye everybody. Thank you.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message. Revolution Radio.
You don't see it, do you? How close we are to absolute chaos? The sick ones are sitting on their fat asses, eating and drink themselves into a stupor, polluting the world without a second thought while it goes down the toilet. Nobody wants to do the nasty work. You know, the shit that we all just think about. Most good citizens are just along for the ride and then bitch and moan and complain about everything when it doesn't work out. Not me. Get it done.
Revolution Radio, where we do the nasty work. www.freedomslips.com.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that is in us. And may God defend the right.
Warning! Warning!
We gotta stop them! They're gonna kill us all! See how the trouble you've started? Be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. Time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it. Right, you tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution